Hey guys, I'm going to show you how I drew this still life step by step and give you some really useful tips for working with pastels along the way. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. I apologise if you hear any noises in the background. There are currently 3 people working from home and also 3 dogs here just because of everything that's happening in the world, so sorry if you hear any random noises. So today I'm working on the Clairefontaine pastel mat, which is like a sanded paper with a really fine grit, so it feels really smooth to work on, but you can still add quite a few layers. The reason that I start with a toned colour rather than white is so that I can use any colour I want, including white, and it will show up. It's also really easy to judge my values this way. So I've mapped out my outline with a projector and I'm just going back through with a white pastel pencil to define some of the areas a bit better before I start. And I'm starting in by blocking the base layer of some of the grapes. And I blocked in the stem just roughly so I can see each individual grape a little bit easier so the outline isn't as confusing. When I do the first few layers of pastel, I don't want to fill up the tooth of the paper too quickly because that will prevent me from adding more layers. So using harder pastels will stop you from filling up the tooth as quickly as if you went straight in with your soft pastel sticks. Because with the soft pastel sticks like the Rembrandt or the Unison or Sennelier or any of those kind of brands, the pigment really comes off of those sticks quite easily, which means that you'll fill up the tooth of the paper quicker. So usually I try and use pan pastels or harder pastels like the Conte sticks or pastel pencils. So I'm using a mix between the Conte pastel sticks, the Prismacolor NuPastels and pastel pencils depending on the colour that I need and how small the area is. If the pencils don't have the colour I'm after, I'll use a stick and vice versa. The good thing about pastels is that they're easily mixable on the paper, so I can lay colours over the top of each other to make new colours if I don't have the colour that I'm wanting. When I do my base layer, I usually make it way more vibrant than the end result needs to be, because I'll be blending it out and muting things down quite a lot in the following layers. Having this really bright base colour underneath will let some of that colour show through in the end result and it creates a lot more depth that way. So I'm just filling in where the basic shapes and colours will go, and I'm trying not to think about the grapes as grapes, but more as abstract shapes and colours, because sometimes it's hard for you to switch your brain from thinking that it knows what a grape looks like, or any subject that you're working on, and actually learning to see what is actually there, which is just shapes and colours. It will look a little odd in the first few layers, but it will come together a bit later on. So here I'm blending out the base layer with a cotton tip, and you can just use a blending stump or anything similar that you have. I like cotton tips because they're inexpensive, small enough to get into some of the detail areas, and I always have them lying around. And for some reason I only blended 4 of the grapes instead of blending all of them. I was probably checking to see what those colours would look like when they're blended together before filling in the rest of the grapes. Here you can see a close-up of how I layer those first few colours down. The white that's already on the grapes is from when I did my outline, so I don't lose my place as easily. But I'm starting with that dark colour. It's not quite black, it's more of a navy blue or indigo, but it's still very dark. And I'm just filling in all of the sections that are dark on each grape, and I'm really looking at my reference photo and making sure that I'm focusing on each grape separately, because the placement of the light and the dark areas needs to be pretty close to the reference. The way the grapes are sitting on top of each other is casting shadows and highlights onto the grapes around them, so I'm making sure that I'm taking the time to get those values relatively accurate. And I'm going over the top of the darker colour with a more mid-tone blue that's a little more saturated in colour. That way the grapes won't look too dull in the dark areas, but it will still look dark. Then I'm taking the white Conte pastel and I'm blocking in the lighter areas. I'm taking a blue to fill in the really bright blue parts of the grapes, and as I said earlier, you can use pastel pencils for the entire piece if you like, but I do try and use the sticks because they're a bit more cost effective because they cover a larger area more quickly. And if you were to do the same with a pencil, you'd have to sharpen away a lot of the pencil, and considering there's not that much pastel inside the pencil in comparison to a pastel stick, you'll end up going through your pencils really quite quickly. So I'm using a few different shades of blue to go between the darkest blue and the lightest blue, and that will help me transition it a bit more smoothly when I blend it out. Okay, so now I'm blending the first layer of grapes with a cotton tip, and the reason that I blend out each layer rather than continue to add more pastel is for a few reasons. One is that it will be a smoother result in the end because I've blended each layer smoothly as I go rather than leaving any harsh pastel strokes or graininess there. The other reason is because your paper will have a limited amount of layers of pastel that you can add to it before you can't add any more pastel. I'm working on the pastel mat, which you can add quite a few layers on in comparison to other generic pastel papers, but it still does have a limit. So by blending your layers out, you'll actually be pushing the pigment into the tooth of the paper and removing some of that pastel dust that sits on top of the surface, and that will allow you to add more layers because there'll be more tooth showing through. If you don't blend out your pastel, it can fill up the tooth of your paper quicker, and you'll have a smooth, slick surface that your pastels just won't stick to. So by doing it this way, you'll be able to add a few more layers on top. So I'm just going to continue that process with the rest of the grapes, blocking in the darker areas, the mid-tones and the highlights, and blending it out again. And I will be adding more layers on top of this as well once the base layer is all blended out. So moving on to the rose, and this is actually one of those mini roses. I'm not sure what the technical term for that is, but they're much smaller than your standard size rose, which is why the grapes look not much smaller than the flower does. Once the whole painting is finished, it will look a lot more natural though, but in the early stages, it looks like I've drawn the rose way too small until everything is finished, and then it looks normal. So when you're working on something like this, make sure that you do get your outline accurate and then copy what you see in the reference photo. Even if it looks a little odd, keep going until you get to the end, and then it will hopefully turn out well if you've copied what you saw. Anyway, I'm working on one petal at a time just so I don't lose my place. And I'm starting with a black in the shadow area and then filling in the midtones and the highlights. And it's the same process as the base layer of the grapes. I'll be blending it out and adding more on top. People always say not to use black in your artwork, but I use black all the time. I just make sure that I glaze other colors over it and don't just leave it plain black. And the reason people don't like black in artwork is because it can look flat, but if you mix in other colors or you glaze other colors over the top, it will look just fine. I'm also using the pastel pencils for this area because they're much smaller than the sticks, and this is quite an intricate area that I'm working on. The roses that are in the background will be a little bit more out of focus, so I'm just getting the general colors blocked in and I'm not spending too much time on those details. Okay, starting on the cheeses, this top cheese is pretty white, but I don't want to just use white because there won't be much depth to it. So I'm layering some yellows and greys and blues and whatever colours I can see glimpses of in my reference photo. And then in the following layers, I'll be blending it out and then saving my white for the brightest highlights. Even the lightest colour that I'm using on this cheese isn't actually white, it's quite a light creamy colour. It just looks white in comparison with the other colours that I have down. Blocking in the shadow area under that first cheese, and I'm going to go in with a brown instead of a black to start with. I'm also working on the top of the next block of cheese. It's got kind of like a flat yellow sort of part on the top, and that shadow area is quite a browny red colour. So always pay attention to the shadows, they're not always just black. There'll be other colours in there as well, so make sure that you find those colours and add them into your artwork because it will give it a lot more depth that way. And moving on to the second cheese, I'm just doing the same thing, looking at where the colour variations are on the cheese and copying those colours and shapes onto my artwork. Again, I'm really exaggerating those colours in the first layer, knowing that they'll look more muted once I blend them out and add more layers. If you're struggling to find out which colour to use, it's not really that important which colour you choose as long as it's close. But if you did want a good example of the colour that's in that area, you can just import your reference photo into a program like Paint or like Photoshop if you have it, or something with an eyedropper tool, and just hover over that area with your eyedropper and select a colour from there. So you'll be able to see what that colour is. You can kind of see if it's a warm colour or a cool colour, or basically what colour it is. So I do that quite a lot, and I usually make colour swatches. So I'll get my reference photo and I'll paint swatches that directly relate to each section of that photo so I can see exactly what colour is in that area of the photo. And that way that will help when you're creating your artwork. But as I said before, it doesn't have to be exact, just close is good enough. If you're a member of my Patreon channel, I've actually been attaching the colour swatch example that I use for my artwork. so that you guys can use that if you want to help choose your colours. Moving on to the third cheese, this one is also white, but it's more of a shiny white than the top cheese is, and it has a more cool tone to it with a lot more blues in there, whereas the top cheese is a bit warmer with yellow tones. And these are the kinds of things that you need to look out for and add into your own artwork to really make them stand out. All of those subtle colour variations. So I'm using a really light cool grey and some light cream to fill in a lot of this cheese because it really is a lot whiter than the other 3 cheeses. I'm still making sure that I don't jump straight to white though. Even if the reference photo looks white, I still use a slightly darker shade first, so when you want to add your highlights, you can still go in with your white on top. So I'm using some olive greens and greys for the shadow areas. I'm also adding some yellowy colours to some of the areas where there is reflected light on the cheese. It's kind of showing up as a warmer yellow on some spots in the reference photo, so I'm making sure that I include that in my artwork because it's obviously there for a reason. It's reflecting the light and colours from around it. Now I'm going to blend out that base layer of all 3 cheeses with a cotton tip, and you can see pretty much straight away that the colours begin to look more cohesive and natural. The brightness and saturation of the colours tend to get muted as soon as you blend it out, which is why I purposely make things more saturated in the first layer, knowing that when I blend it, it will dull it down a bit. I'm also leaving some of the strokes on the first and second cheese visible, because they do have a little bit of a rougher texture than the third cheese does. So with the third cheese, where it's quite a lot smoother and shinier, I'm making sure I spend a lot longer blending the colours together, using small circular motions to really smooth it out. Whereas with the first 2, I'm not spending as much time making it as smooth because I want some of those strokes to show through to create that texture. And before I start on the 4th cheese, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then head over and check out my Patreon channel. For as little as $4 per month, you will have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using so you really can follow along every step of the way. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so that you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So blocking in the 4th cheese, I'm purposely using the pastel on its side because it creates a rougher texture with more graininess showing through. The last cheese has quite a rough texture to it, so I'm using the pastels to my advantage that way. Moving on to the rose leaves. Most of them are out of focus and blended into the background, so I'm just blocking in the general colours and I'm not focusing on the details too much because I'll be blending it out smoothly. For the background, to get an out of focus look, the best way that I've found is to use pan pastels. And I'll leave a link in the description to a video showing you all about pan pastels in case you haven't heard of them before. But basically, they're a soft pastel that's pressed into a pan that you can apply using tools and sponges. So here you can see what they look like in one of the trays that they supply. And they can come in over 80 colours that you can also blend together to make new colours. I'm just mixing up colours between some of the browns, the reds, the olive greens and the greys. The first layer with these always looks a little bit patchy and streaky, but once you add more pastel, it will become smoother and easier to blend together for smoother transitions. Towards the area where the roses are, I'm going to use a bit more green to show that there is some greenery in the out of focus background. And I'm just varying the shades of green to give it some variation. And I'm going to build up the colours until they start to blend smoothly together and look a bit less harsh. I'm adding quite a lot of browns, blacks, and dark reds to the corners and the edges of the page, because having darker edges really brings the viewer's eye back into the main subject, which in this case is the grapes. When the background is lighter and an even value, it can make your viewer's eye drift off the page, so having those darker edges brings the attention back into the painting. So I'm just blending the background with my fingers, but you can use a tissue wrapped around your finger if you don't want to get your hands dirty. And then I'm adding another layer of pan pastel to the background, and this will help smooth things out. And also I'm taking the time to make that middle section a little bit brighter, so in contrast the outer edges will look a little bit darker. This blue tool that I've got here is a soft tool, and that's spelt SOFFT. And it's the same type of sponge as the ones I was using earlier to apply the background with, but it's a small cover that goes over the top of a plastic tool for smaller areas. The soft tools come in all different shapes and sizes, but I would recommend using the bigger sponges where possible, and then you can squeeze them into the shape that you need to get into the smaller areas. The smaller sponges that go on these blue tools tend to wear away quite quickly, especially if you're working on sanded paper, because you're literally sanding away the sponge. So using the bigger sponges where you can will mean that you wear them away less. I try and only use the smaller soft sponges when I'm needing smaller details or once I've got a few layers of pastel down, so that it's not directly going onto the sanded paper. So I'm starting on the second layer of details, and I'm concentrating on getting the details in the right place now. So I'm making sure that the colours are in the right place as well, and really looking at my reference photo as much as I can. When I work, I actually look at my reference photo more than my own artwork to make sure that I'm drawing it accurately. And then I'm blending it out to soften the pastel strokes. And I'm not blending it out too much because I still want some of the different colours to stay separate, and I want some of the texture to show through. So I'm just going to continue this process for all 4 of the cheeses. The second cheese is quite textured, so I'm purposely using my pastels on the side to create some of that texture, and I'm not blending it out smoothly. I'm only gently blending the layers so that my strokes show through. The third one is the shinier one, so I'm making sure my blending is much smoother. The fourth one is interesting because of all the lines in the cheese. There's a lot of texture there, so I'm gonna go through and try and recreate that with pencil strokes. And I'm also building up some of that rougher texture with a lot of dots and little scribble marks. So building up another layer on the rose, just switching between the reds, the pinks and oranges in the lighter areas and the darker colours for the centre part of each petal. And I'm working on the leaves that are in front of the rose, which are a bit more in focus. I'm following the same process of blocking in different shades of green, blending it out and adding more layers on top. When working in realism, the most important thing to worry about is your values. People get so worried about the colours that they need for each section, but in reality, if your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are bright enough, that's going to be much more important than worrying about your colour. Your colours can be slightly off, just pick a colour that looks close to the reference. It doesn't have to be perfect. And if it doesn't look quite right, try a different colour. The thing is, I could paint this in black and white, or I could put an interesting filter over the reference photo and tint the entire photo a different colour, and it will still look realistic, which shows you that the values are what's more important to making something look real. So I'm starting another layer on the grapes, and this is where it starts to get a bit more punchy and realistic. I'm really making those shadows dark to create a 3D effect. My highlights are really bright as well. I'm also adding a bit of purple into this layer to make it look a bit more vibrant and give it more interest, so it's not just all different shades of blue. Some of the edges of the grapes have quite a bright reflective highlight on the edge, so I'm using a white pastel pencil to create that line, but I'm making sure to blend it out so that it doesn't look like an outline. I'm also being careful where I'm doing this because not all of the grapes have a bright highlight on the edge, and even the grapes that do have that highlight, it doesn't go all the way around the grape. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to that on your reference photo and don't just add it to every grape because it looked good on the first one. You've probably heard me say this before, but I like to have some of my pastel strokes show through on my artwork. My goal isn't to replicate a photo. I really want my work to look like artwork. So when you look at my pieces from a distance, it can look quite realistic and it can look like a photo from that far away, but when you get closer, you can still see that it's just a bunch of pastel strokes, colours and shapes. I really like looking at the beautiful paintings in art galleries and seeing how realistic they look from a normal viewing distance, and then when you come closer to the painting, you can see all of the strokes. I think it requires a lot of talent and skill to create artwork like that. And it's obviously up to you how much detail you want to put into things, but I like getting the general gist of things and letting the viewer's eye make up the rest. And for me personally, I'm quite a perfectionist, and a lot of artists are as well, so it's taken me a long time to work out when to stop adding more details. It's really quite a challenge for me. I have to continuously step back and look at my artwork from a normal viewing distance, or take a photo of my artwork to look at on my phone, so that way it's a smaller version of it, and work out whether the detail that I'm adding can actually be seen from a little further away, and if it can't, and then I need to stop adding that detail. I used to spend way too much time on the fine details of a piece when it didn't really look much different than it did hours beforehand. So I need to follow the saying that done is better than perfect. As long as I'm happy with it from a normal viewing distance, then I'll move on to my next piece, because there could be an unlimited amount of time that I spend on it otherwise. So I couldn't quite decide how I wanted the roses in the background to be, because in the reference they were quite prominent and I wanted to keep the grapes the main focus of this piece, so I decided to soften the main rose and create some out of focus roses in the background to blend it together and look a bit more cohesive. If you get to a point where you added too much pastel onto your paper and you can't seem to add any more layers, which is what I done in the rose area because I couldn't make up my mind, I kept going over the top of it, then you can actually switch to using softer pastels like the Rembrandt or Unison or Sennelier or whatever brand you like that's a bit more of a softer pastel. I find that the softer pastels can really lay on top of the previous layers of harder pastels if you're struggling to get those finer details or getting an extra layer. It's quite useful to brighten up any of the colours that might be looking dull as well, or to darken or put any highlights on top. The Caran d'Ache pastel pencils are also the softest pastel pencil that I've found so far, and they're great for adding in smaller details on top if you can't do it with your normal pastel pencils. Because I have a mixture of the Derwent pastels, the Carbothello pastel pencils, and the Faber-Castell Pitt pastels, and they're all pretty similar in how soft they are or how hard they are. They're a little bit on the harder side, whereas the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils are really soft. They're quite expensive though, and because they're so soft, they crumble really easily, so I would not recommend sharpening them in a normal sharpener. I'd use a Stanley knife or a craft knife to shave away the wooden casing on the outside, and even then they tend to break quite easily, but that's normal with softer pastels, so I tend to just use those when I have to create a brighter highlight or a darker area and I can't do it with the other brands. This tutorial on the screen explains exactly what pan pastels are and how to use them, and the playlist that's below that has a bunch of other pastel tutorials that I think you might enjoy. And if you would like real-time tutorials where I take you through each project step by step, then click on the Patreon link in the description below.